Hello everybody, welcome to NEET Crash Course Biology. So now we will be discussing a quick synopsis of firstly the chapter Principles of Inheritance and Variation. In this, we are mainly going to focus upon Mendelian genetics. As you all are aware, Mendel performed his famous pea plant experiments for 7 years between 1856 to 1863, and then he read it out in the meetings of the Natural History Society of Brunner or Brunn in 1865, and later it was published under the title of Experiments in Plant Hybridization in 1866. However, sadly, his work was not recognized, and almost 16 years later, 16 years after his death, Mendel died in 1884, and 16 years after his death, his work was duly recognized, and he is now credited as the father of genetics. What did Mendel study? Mendel basically studied the garden pea plant, and they were basically exhibiting two contrasting traits. He basically chose a lot of contrasting traits which were expressed in the pea plant. Like, for example, he chose seven important pair of contrasting traits, or basically a total of 14 traits or seven characters. And some of the most common characters and traits you must have heard of is tall and dwarf, and yellow and green seed, etc. So here you have the list of these seven characters. It is very important to learn the list of these seven characters that Mendel studied, and you have the two traits here, the dominant and the recessive trait. He studied some of the characters like stem height, that is how tall the plant grows, tall and dwarf, and position of the flower, axial and terminal, the shape of the fruit or the pod in the case of pea, the color of the pod, the shape of the seed, the color of the seed, and the flower color. Okay. He basically gave the concept of unit character, in that he said that each character is a unit and each character is governed by a specific factor. Now, he did not obviously know anything about genes and alleles, so he basically simply called it as a factor. So Mendel has been known to call these units of heredity, which we today know as gene or allele, as factors. And you know the concept of dominance. When there is a cross involving two pure breeding parents in the F1 generation, always remember, in the F1 generation, one of the traits or one of the characters or the parental character is expressed while the other is suppressed. The one that gets expressed is the dominant, and the latter is referred to as recessive. Then if you look at his monohybrid cross, you know that what is a monohybrid cross. First of all, a monohybrid cross is a cross involving two pure breeding parents differing only in one character or differing in one pair of contrasting traits. So here he chose height as the character of interest, and height exists in tall and dwarf. So he basically crossed a pure breeding tall pea plant with a pure breeding dwarf pea plant, and he came about with the concept of dominance in the F1 generation. And you all are aware that on self-pollinating the F1 generation, in the F2 generation, he obtained both tall and dwarf. Surprisingly, in the F1 generation, he thought that the dwarf plants had the dwarf trait had disappeared because none of the plants in the F1 generation were dwarf. But in the F2 generation, both tall and dwarf plants were obtained in the ratio of 3:1. So a rough representation of Mendel's monohybrid cross, you can see the pure breeding tall pea plant, which is homozygous capital T. Here it is homozygous small t, that is the pure breeding dwarf pea plant. Remember, according to Mendel's scheme, we represent the gene which is responsible for tallness by capital T, and the notation given to the gene that is responsible for dwarfness is small t. So here you can see a gene that is the genotype of capital T, small t, and the gametes are pure, as in they contain only one copy of the allele. The hybrid is capital T, small t, and in the F2 generation you can see you get a phenotypic ratio of 3:1. And remember, the genotypic ratio in the F2 generation is 1:2:1. You get one homozygous dominant, two of them are heterozygous dominant, and the third one is a homozygous recessive. So, based on his idea and then based on his observation, that surprisingly in the F2 generation, suddenly the dwarf plants had reappeared, and that's where he gave the law of segregation or the law of purity of gametes. And this is referred to as, actually, this is the second law, it is not the first law. Mendel's dominance is the first law, and this is considered to be the second law of inheritance. Accordingly, he said that even though the dominant, that is capital T, and the small t alleles remain together in the F1 hybrid, you all are aware that they don't blend or they don't contaminate but faithfully segregate during the time of gametogenesis, such that a gamete receives either capital T or it is small t, and such gametes are considered to be pure. So here is a schematic representation of a slightly modified monohybrid cross. It is referred to as the test cross. Now in test cross, you know the phenotype, so you're looking at it and you're telling that yes, it is a purple flowered plant, but you don't know whether it is capital W or capital W small w. So what do you do in this case? You take this particular F1 plant, that is the purple flowered plant, and you cross it with a double recessive parent. When you cross it with a recessive parent, if you get a ratio of 1:1, that means the F1 plant was capital W small w. If you do not get, or if you see all of them are expressing the dominant trait, that means the F1 hybrid under question was homozygous dominant. So this is done when you don't know the genotype and you have to determine the genotype, but you know the phenotype, that yes, it is purple in color. Okay. In dihybrid cross, he considered two pure breeding parents which are differing in two pairs of contrasting traits. Now, he basically considered two characters. The two characters that he considered was seed shape and seed color, and the pair of contrasting traits were two pairs of contrasting traits. And you can see in this cross, in the F1 generation, before that, the parents that were taken were pure breeding plant with round and yellow seeds, and crossed with pure breeding plant with wrinkled and green. In the F1 generation, all of them were round and yellow. This indicates that round is dominant over wrinkled and yellow is dominant over green. And you can see how on selfing in the F2 generation you get a phenotypic ratio of 9:3:3:1. But you can see in this phenotypic ratio, two of them are new characters or new combinations of characters, round with green and wrinkled with yellow, meaning the character of the seed shape has nothing to do with the character of seed color. It is not that the shape of round is always tied to the color of yellow, or the shape of green is always, the shape of wrinkled is always tied to the color of green. Sometimes you can get two different combinations, like you can get a round seed which is green colored, or you can get a wrinkled seed which is yellow in color. This led to his next law, the third and the major law, which is referred to as the law of independent assortment. So remember, the law of independent assortment was the third law of Mendel. According to the law of independent assortment, he said that when there are two pairs of contrasting traits involved, one is round and one is wrinkled, one is green and one is yellow, the inheritance or the assortment or the separation or the segregation of one pair of characters or one pair of traits is independent of the other. When two pairs of traits are combined in a hybrid, the NCERT definition says when two pairs of traits are combined in a hybrid, the segregation or assortment or inheritance of one pair is independent of the other, and the genotypic ratio for the F2 generation in case of dihybrid cross is 1:2:2:1:4:2:1:2:1. Incomplete dominance is a deviation from Mendelism, because this is something which was not seen in Mendel's laws or this was not proposed by Mendel's laws. How a red flowered snapdragon is crossed with a white flowered snapdragon. Both of them are pure breeding, capital R, small r, small r. Surprisingly, in the F1 generation, you will have plants which are bearing flowers which are neither red nor white. You get pink colored flowers. So what does this indicate? This indicates that the feature of the F1 generation, the phenotype of the F1 generation, the definition is important. The phenotype of the F1 generation is not resembling either of the parents. It is not red, it is not white, it is in between the two. And you can see in the typical incomplete dominance or semi-dominance or blended. So it's like the characters, the traits are blending. Red is blending with white to give a new color, that is pink. That's why incomplete dominance or semi-dominance is also referred to as a blended inheritance. And you can see how the phenotypic and the genotypic ratio are both the same in the case of incomplete dominance. Remember the plant in which incomplete dominance was first experimented. It is on the plant called snapdragon or dog flower. It is called Antirrhinum majus. The best example for codominance and multiple allele is the ABO blood system in case of humans. This chart will give you a quick overview. What determines your blood group? Your blood group is determined by sugar polymers that are projecting from the plasma membrane of your RBC. And these sugar polymers are referred to as antigen. If you have antigen A, you have blood group A. If there is antigen B on your RBC, you belong to blood group B. If you have both antigen A and antigen B on your RBC, you belong to blood group AB. If you do not have antigens on your RBC, you belong to blood group O. And there are three alleles which control the blood group. That's why it is, actually there is only one gene, that is I, and this gene exists in three allelic forms, that is IA, IB as well as small I. Since there are more than two allelic forms for this gene existing in the population, please remember there are more than three in the population, but only two can occur in a human at a given point of time, because we have paired chromosomes, we are diploid creatures. So this condition where a gene exists in more than three allelic forms is called as multiple allelism. All of you remember IA and IB are dominant, whereas small I is recessive. So see the possible genotypes. The person with blood group A can be homozygous IA, or he may be heterozygous IAIO. Small I allele is also denoted by another notation, that is capital IO. Similarly, a person with blood group B may be homozygous IB, or he may be heterozygous IBIO. Similarly, a person with blood group AB, there is only one possible genotype, and this is where the concept of codominance comes into picture. Because imagine when the person has one copy of IA and one copy of IB, both the genes cooperate with each other. They decide that, come on, let's express together, let's not have a fight with each other, and that is referred to as codominance. That's the reason the person has both antigen A and antigen B. Both of them are expressing themselves independently and fully, and this is called codominance. The only way a person can be of a O blood group is IOIO or small I, because small I is recessive. A recessive allele can express itself only in homozygous condition. And what is small I responsible for? Small I is responsible for lack of antigens on the RBC. If there is no antigen on the RBC, then the blood group is designated as O. Accordingly, if you see some of the alleles, how the parents contribute, you can see that I want all of you to observe this table given in your NCERT textbook. Which parent is contributing which allele, and what is the genotype of the offspring, and based on the genotype, what is the blood group of the offspring. A lot of problems may be asked on the same. Please remember, if it is heterozygous IAIO, still you have blood group A, because all of you should remember one thing: the small I allele or the IO allele is recessive, so it is always allowing the dominant to express itself. When does the small I allele express itself? Only in a double recessive condition that is observed only in one blood group case, that is blood group O. What is pleiotropic gene? A single gene product having more than one effect. The best example is starch synthesis. There are two alleles which control the starch synthesis in pea plant. One is capital B and one is small b. Now this gene, that is capital B and small b, they are not only responsible for the size of the starch grain in the seed, but they are also responsible for the color of the they're also responsible for the shape of the seed. So please remember that one gene is not only controlling the size of the starch grain, but it is also controlling the shape of the seed. And this kind of an example where one gene product has multiple effect is referred to as pleiotropy. In pleiotropy, in this particular case, you can see a peculiar phenomenon when capital B and small b come together. Even though the seed shape will be round, that means it shows a case of pure dominance. However, the starch grain will not be larger in size or smaller in size. It will be intermediate size starch grain. So this indicates that because of the intermediate size starch grain, one thing that you need to remember here is that When it comes to the shape, it exhibits pure dominance. When it comes to the shape of the starch, the size of the starch grain, it exhibits incomplete dominance or semi-dominance. This shows that dominance is not an innate feature of the gene. It depends upon what product the gene is producing and how it interacts with the other gene product and what kind of an influence it has on a specific chemical pathway within the cell. So remember, in pleiotropy, you can also see that there are two different scenarios where a heterozygous plant can exhibit like capital B, small b. Although the seeds are round, the starch grain inside the seeds are of medium size or intermediate size. So if you look at it from the perspective of the seed shape, it is pure dominance. If you look at it from the perspective of the size of the starch grain, it is semi-dominance. Reasons why Mendel's work remained unrecognized for a long time is because communication was not as quick as it is today. There was no social media, there was no internet, so Mendel could not widely publicize his work, and many people did not believe. Many people did not believe that Mendel said that the factors are discrete. There is no blending. The first concept is law of segregation, where there is no blending or contamination between the factors. But those classical biologists back then and geneticists back then, they were very fascinated by the idea of blending, and therefore they could not agree with Mendel. And also his approach of using mathematics was not welcomed by the scientists of that era. Okay. And also Mendel could not provide any physical proof. He kept saying that there are discrete units called factors, but he could not show those factors because while Mendel was working, nothing was discovered yet, the microscope, or even he could not see the chromosomes under the cell. But today we know that the chromosomes are packaged with DNA, and the segment of DNA which what Mendel called as factor back then is nothing but the gene or an allele which is capable of coding for a specific protein, or which is capable of coding for a specific trait or character. And thanks to three scientists independently, coincidentally, Hugo de Vries and Carl Carens, as well as Schermark, these were the three scientists who luckily, fortunately, coincidentally, in three separate independent circumstances, they happened to rediscover Mendel's work. They repeated all his experiments. They found the exact same results which were proposed by Mendel in his work. And after that, they went on to say that for this reason, we have to give Mendel the due credit that we should call him the father of genetics. And then, like I said, with the advent of microscopy, people started seeing chromosomes, and by 1902, how the chromosomes started moving during meiosis was worked out, and that is when two scientists, Walter Sutton and Theodore Boveri, came up with their famous theory that is called the chromosomal theory of inheritance. For the chromosomal theory of inheritance, they saw there was a very close parallel between the behavior of chromosomes and the genes. Now, accordingly, just like how genes occur in two allelic pairs, chromosomes also occur in pairs which are called as homologous chromosomes. Like how Mendel said that genes undergo or alleles are separated during meiosis, even the chromosomes get separated during meiosis. Specifically, you know that during anaphase 1 of meiosis, the homologous pairs get segregated, and that is same parallel between what Mendel said, that though the factors remain together for a very long time, they get segregated, they get pushed away from each other during the time of meiosis. And during anaphase 1, that's exactly what I was telling you now, the homologous chromosomes get separated from each other and they are no longer paired with each other, and then separation of one pair of homologous chromosome is independent of the other pair, just like separation of one pair of genes or alleles is independent of the other. Like how Mendel said, the feature of seed shape is not always associated with the feature of seed color, because the alleles controlling the seed shape are sought independently from the alleles controlling seed color. Then you have this, they have given the legend for this diagram over here, the orange, yellow and all that. So if you see the chromosomes here, how the chromosomes have aligned in meiosis 1, and in meiosis 1 in anaphase, how they are getting pulled away from each other. The alignment is possible in two different ways. In one of the forms, the orange color chromosome is carried away with green, orange is along with green is getting dragged away. In the other one, yellow is getting dragged away with red. So orange and green go to one pair and yellow and red go to another pair. But there is another form of arrangement where the orange chromosome can move with the red chromosome, and the yellow chromosome can get arranged with the green chromosome. So this will make sure that, imagine if there was if the movement was always associated with each other, if there was no independent assortment, then it would be that wherever orange goes, green goes there, wherever yellow goes, red also goes there. But that is not the case, because wherever orange goes, green is not always following it, because in the next scenario you are seeing that orange is moving along with red. So this shows that orange and green and yellow and red are not dependent on each other. Whether orange moves to one side or yellow moves to the other side does not depend upon whether green moves to the same side or red moves to the other side. So it can be any side, and therefore you can say that orange and green are not associated with each other, they are not linked with each other, and this is referred to as independent assortment. So this comparison was drawn actually between the chromosomes and genes. Like we saw, they both occur in pairs, they both segregate during the time of anaphase 1 of meiosis. Their segregation happens in such a way that the separation of one pair of homologous chromosome does not depend on the other pair of homologous chromosomes. And this was the argument of Sutton and Boveri, that they said that there is something which carries the gene, and that vehicle of the hereditary material, the vehicle that carries the gene, is the chromosome. And they basically united their knowledge in the chromosomal segregation and Mendelian principle, and they said what Mendel had said many years ago is exactly correct, and they unified that concept as the chromosomal theory of inheritance. Experimental verification. A chromosomal theory of inheritance was verified by the father of experimental genetics. The father of experimental genetics is Thomas Hunt Morgan. He worked exclusively on the fruit flies. Why was he so fascinated by the fruit flies? Because fruit fly, which is rightly called the Cinderella of genetics, everybody who does research in genetics wants to study fruit flies first, and it is the best means to study, because it has only a diploid number of 8. It can be grown in a very simple synthetic medium in the lab. Fruit flies complete their life cycle in just about 2 weeks. A single mating can produce a large number of progeny, and it is very easy to distinguish between their sexes. They are sexually dimorphic. There are certain external features which can help you identify the differences in their sex, and they also exhibit lot of several hereditary variations which are easily observable. Whatever changes happen in their genetic material, it quickly becomes evident on their body, which can easily be monitored, and therefore T.H. Morgan considered the Drosophila as a model organism for his study. Now, in the concept of linkage, what T.H. Morgan identified is, if two genes are located closer to each other. Now see here, this is a gene which is coding for the yellow body, and this is a gene that is coding for white eye, and Y plus is a gene that is coding for, whenever you see a plus sign in the gene, that means it is wild type or dominant, and whenever you see no plus sign, it means it is a mutant. A mutant is a modified allele, is a recessive allele. So a female which was mutant with yellow body and white eye, she is homozygous because she carries 2 X chromosomes, and the genes are located on both the X chromosome. Why here only the genes are shown in one of the chromosome? Because the light blue chromosome is the X chromosome, and the dark blue chromosome is the Y chromosome. They are non-homologous. So whatever genes you find on the X chromosome, you will not find them in the Y chromosome. And so that was crossed with a male which had a gray body, a brown body, and red eye. And surprisingly, it was seen that in the F1 generation we got wild type females. Wild type female because the female inherits one of her X chromosome from her father, who contributed the light blue chromosome which has the wild type or the dominant alleles, and the son is affected. Why is the son affected? Because the son inherits his Y chromosome from the father, but sadly he is receiving a mutant X chromosome carrying alleles for yellow body and white eyes from the mother. And when it was crossed in the F1 generation, notice here they got more parental types, 98.7%, and less recombinant types. And why more parental types? That means most of them had either yellow with white, or they had brown body with red. Very few of them, you can see here, new traits are found, that is brown body with white eyes is there, and here you can see there is yellow body with red eyes. So new characters were very less, only 1.3%, but parental characters were very more. Why? That means that the gene Y and W are very close to each other. So when they undergo when there is cell division during a cross, when there is meiosis or gamete formation, they do not get separated from each other easily. Now, why do they not get separated easily from each other? Because they are physically present very close to each other. When two genes located on the same homologous pair are physically located so close to each other that they produce more parental combination in the F2 generation than the new combination, then we call this phenomenon as linkage. And a linkage is basically determined by the distance between the two genes. The closer the genes, the lesser is the recombination frequency. So recombination frequency and the distance are basically inversely proportional. Okay, so recombination frequency will be lesser if linkage is very, very stronger. So you can consider it like this. You can say linkage is inversely proportional to recombination. That means if recombination frequency is less, that means the linkage is very, very strong. In the first example, you can see the recombination frequency is very less, that is 1.3% only. That means the linkage is very strong. That's why if you see the picture, they have shown the Y and the W chromosomes are present very, very close to each other. In the second experiment, if you see, the recombination frequency has increased to 37.2 chromosome. That is because if you see the chromosome, the gene considered here is basically the white eye as well as the miniature wing. You can see how the genes are present very, very far away from each other. If the genes are far away from each other, we say that the linkage is loose and we get a very high recombination frequency. If the genes are present very, very close to each other, we say that the linkage is tight and we get what? A very low recombination frequency of 1.3%. Types of sex determination, in this case XXXO type of sex determination is seen specially in insects where all the eggs bear X chromosome, but 50% of the sperm will have X chromosome and the other 50% do not have X chromosome. This type of XXXY type is called as male heterogamety because the male is XO. That means the male is the one who is going to produce two different types of gametes, 50% with X chromosome and 50% without any sex chromosome at all. This kind of sex determination is seen in grasshoppers, crickets, cockroaches, etc. Now the most famous type of male, again this is a type of male heterogamety. As you can see, male is XY chromosome. Now male heterogamety means the male produces two different types of gametes. Here the male produces 50% of the gametes with X chromosome and the other 50% of the gametes with Y chromosome. Again the female is homogametic here because the female produces all eggs with only X chromosome. This is called the ligase type of sex determination. It is seen in Drosophila as well as in humans. So we saw that in case of both, we say that the male is the one that is producing two different types of gametes, and since the male is the one that is producing two different types of gametes, we call this as male heterogamety. So in both the cases of XXXO type and XXXY type, the common feature we saw is the male is producing two different types of gametes. Then we have another peculiar type of sex determination where notice how the female is ZW type. She has two different allosomes or sex chromosomes which are unlike, that is Z and W, and the male has two alike sex chromosomes, that is Z and Z. So this condition where the female has two unlike sex chromosomes is referred to as female heterogamety. So now can you guess, based on your memory, who produces two different types of gametes? Yes, you're right. The female is the one who produces two different types of gametes. In humans, we already discussed, we have the typical male heterogamety type of sex determination, that is XXXY type of sex determination, in which the females carry one pair of X chromosome which are alike, and the males are called hemizygous because they have only one X chromosome along with a non-homologous Y chromosome. So it is always the male that produces two different types of gametes. What exactly is mutation? Any kind of alteration in the DNA sequences. Ultimately, it is not just alteration that can make it a mutation. There should be some kind of a change which is reflected in the phenotype or the visible appearance of a particular organism. Sometimes a gene gets mutated whereas few nucleotides are deleted. It is called deletion. Sometimes new nucleotides are added. It is called insertion. Sometimes a nucleotide is represented more than once. It is called duplication. So moving on to genetic analysis, the best way to identify genetic disorders or genetic issues in case of humans is because in humans you cannot conduct control crosses like in other organisms. So the best thing would be to take the family history of a particular and therefore of a particular disorder, like say for example a person is suffering from a genetic disease. Try and identify if anybody in his immediate family is suffering from, or did he get it passed on from his grandfather, or some of his distant relative might have it, and that shows that it is within the gene pool of the family. So basically what you're going to do is you're going to collect all the data from the past of a particular person and from the family of a particular person, and you are going to represent it in the form of a graphical representation, which is nothing but in the form of a family tree. Okay, so these are some of the common symbols that are used in pedigree analysis. If you write a square without shading it, it's a male. If you show a circle, it's a female. If you put a diamond sign, that means, say for example, there was somebody in your ancestral family, say in your great 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 grandfather, or say your great grandfather had some 10 children, and you do not know if the last child was, say, a male or a female. You don't have sufficient data about whether the child was a male or a female. So the best thing to do is put a diamond sign, because the sex is unspecified. And if you shade it like it is shaded in red over here, that means all these individuals are affected with some kind of a genetic disease, and therefore they are sufferers of some kind of genetic disorders. If you connect them with a single horizontal line, that indicates marriage or mating. If you connect them with two horizontal lines, that means they have married within close relatives. It is called consanguineous mating. And if you show a vertical line coming out of the horizontal line, and you show these two other symbols over here, then this represents the first generation, the progeny, that are children born to them in the order of birth from left to right. So first they had a normal daughter, and then they bore a normal son. And then if you show a child represented in shaded condition here, that means they gave, like for example, this couple, that is the father and the mother, gave birth to a child who was severely affected by a genetic disease. And instead of writing 5 diamonds, say for example you knew that somebody had 10 children, out of them you don't know whether the 5 children were male or female, so you put a diamond sign and write 5 inside instead of writing the diamond sign 5 times. Okay, what are Mendelian disorders? Mendelian disorders are those disorders which follow a Mendelian pattern of inheritance, and they are classified into two types: the gene disorders or Mendelian disorders, and lastly we will be discussing about the genetic chromosomal disorders. So when we talk about Mendelian disorders, we are mostly talking about disorders related to specific genes on the chromosome. They may be dominant gene, they may be recessive gene, but if you study the pattern in which they are passed on from the parents to the offspring, it follows the principles of Mendelian genetics. Most common Mendelian disorders are hemophilia, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, color blindness, phenylketonuria, thalassemia. We will be discussing a few, like for example, if you have a sex-linked recessive allele, that means it is a gene located on the X chromosome and it is not a dominant gene, H for hemophilia, but I've written small h because it is a recessive gene that is responsible for hemophilia. Now imagine a female who has two X chromosome is heterozygous for this, meaning she has small h on the other. On the other, if I don't write anything, it is understood that there is a capital H. So she will not be a sufferer. This particular female will be a carrier because she is heterozygous for the hemophilic allele. Now, when can a female be hemophilic? It's very rare for the female to be hemophilic. That means on both her X chromosomes, she should carry a small h allele. Then only she will be a female who is affected by hemophilia. And what about male? Male is very easily hemophilic because a male carries one X and one Y chromosome. Even if he has a single copy of small h on the X chromosome, there is no corresponding dominant on the Y chromosome to suppress it. So even with a single copy of small h on one of his X chromosome, the male becomes affected. So it is very, very commonly seen in the case of male, and this condition where male has only one X chromosome is called hemizygous. So bear in mind that males are most frequently affected by this disorder, because males, all they need is just one X chromosome inherited from their mother, a mother who is a carrier. So there is no allele for hemophilia on the Y chromosome. That's why hemophilia is referred to as an X-linked genetic disorder. It is called X-linked because it is restricted to the X chromosome. In sickle cell anemia is a different case. It is mostly an autosomal recessive gene. There is a gene called HBS which is responsible for abnormal hemoglobin, and this is what causes a condition that is called sickle cell anemia. Now, sickle cell anemia, as the name itself indicates, the gene is not located on the sex chromosome, the genes are located on the autosome. So what if a person has two copies of HBS and that is HBS and HBS on his autosome, that is on his first any one out of the first 23 pairs of chromosomes, then he is affected. So this is an affected person. It is irrespective of sex here, because it is not the sex chromosome that is carrying this gene, it is the autosome. What if a person has HBA and HBS? If a person has HBA and HBS, it is said to be a person will be a carrier. He will not suffer from sickle cell anemia, but he will be a carrier. But if a person has two normal alleles, that is HBA and HBA, then he will be a perfectly normal person. So which is the allele responsible for normal hemoglobin production? It is HBA. It happens to be dominant. And which is the allele responsible for abnormal sickle cell anemic hemoglobin production? It is designated a notation of HBS. And what happens in hemoglobin is, in hemoglobin there are two chains, alpha and beta chain. In sickle cell anemia, it is the beta chain of hemoglobin that is affected. In the beta chain of hemoglobin, in the 6th position, there are so many amino acids in the beta chain, about 146 amino acids in the beta chain. Out of them, the 6th amino acid is normally glutamic acid, but in this person it is replaced by valine. So remember, in the beta chain, out of all the 146 amino acid, the 6th amino acid, which should be glutamic acid, in this case it is replaced by valine. Phenylketonuria is another genetic disorder, and this is also a gene that is autosomal and recessive. Say for example, I will give it the notation of capital P for normal gene and small p for a gene responsible for phenylketonuria. You can imagine a person who is small p will be affected by this condition referred to as phenylketonuria. Why should the person have two copies of small p? Because it is understood that whenever an allele is recessive, a recessive allele can express itself only in what condition? Only in homozygous condition. So for a recessive allele to express itself, it should always be in a double recessive or a homozygous condition. And the affected individual here, phenylketonuria, is also called inborn error of metabolism, because the affected individual will not have an enzyme here. The enzyme that is missing is called phenylalanine hydroxylase, which is responsible for the conversion of an amino acid called phenylalanine to tyrosine. As a result, phenylalanine will keep accumulating in the system. It will get converted to a more toxic form that is called phenylpyruvic acid, and when the phenylpyruvic acid accumulates in the brain, it results in mental retardation, and it is also lost in the urine because it is poorly absorbed by the kidney. Okay, so with this we complete all the genetic disorders, most of it which are important for your NEET exam. So I think the next chapter that we will be, so we are left with chromosomal disorders. What is aneuploidy? Now, for example, in humans, you know it is 2n is equal to 46. If one or more chromosomes become in excess, if one or more chromosomes become excess, or if one or few chromosomes become short, that is, if they are lost, then it leads to a condition. So you should say there is a gain or a loss of chromosome in this case, and that is the normal diploid set. You are not altering the entire set. You are keeping the set as it is. Either there is one or two extra or one or two shortage of chromosomes, that is referred to as aneuploidy. Why there are such imbalances created in the chromosome? That is because of failure of normal segregation. You all know normal segregation happens during anaphase 1 of meiosis 1, during cell division. During gamete formation, if this does not happen normally, then it results in this condition that is referred to as aneuploidy. So we say that it is due to non-disjunction that is happening during cell division that results in a gain or a loss of chromosome. So we saw that there is either generally we have 46 chromosomes, we have 22 pairs of chromosomes, 22 pairs, 23 pairs we have, 22 pairs are referred to as autosomes, and one is referred to as sex chromosome. Out of the 22 pairs, maybe one pair has one extra, then you can imagine that pair will have 3 instead of 2. Or if you imagine out of the 22 pairs, in any one pair, if I remove one chromosome, instead of 2 there will be 1. See, for example, loss of one chromosome from a pair in a diploid set, it is 2n minus 1, then that sadly that pair has become single, that is called monosomy. And if there is an addition to a pair, the pair becomes a trio, it is called trisomy. If I remove both from a pair, I am completely eliminating one pair. Say from 23 pairs I remove, say from 22 pairs of autosomes I remove one pair, then the number of autosomes in your genome becomes 21 pair, that is referred to as nullisomy, because you are removing both the members, the entire pair you are removing. Suppose you add two chromosomes to a pair, to the same pair, then you will see that in a pair, because 2 is added, it is 2 plus 2, 2 of a pair plus 2 that is added, which is 4, and that's why this condition is called tetrasomy. You all know about Down syndrome. Down syndrome is autosomal trisomy. That is because the 21st pair has an extra chromosome. So in the 21st pair, I told you that we have 22 pairs of autosomes and one pair of sex chromosome. In the 21st pair of autosome, there is one extra chromosome, and as a result of which what happens, the 21st pair has 3 instead of 2 chromosomes, and therefore it is referred to as trisomy. So it is having a chromosomal complement of 45. Why 44 plus 1? Because 1 is extra. The sex is not altered here. It may either be, the fetus may be a male or a female. The chromosome under question is not an allosome or a sex chromosome. It is an autosome. The affected individual is short-statured with round head, furrowed tongue, and partially open mouth. Palm has a characteristic palm crease, and physical, psychomotor, and mental development is retarded. In Klinefelter syndrome, all of you notice it is allosomal trisomy or allosomal hyperploidy. Hyperploidy because one chromosome is excess. So there is, you can say, one X chromosome is in excess over here. The individual is a male, however, he does show feminine development like gynecomastia because of the presence of an extra X chromosome. That's why, since Klinefelter syndrome mostly affects the sex chromosome, it is called allosomal trisomy. Turner syndrome is again is allosomal hypoploidy or monosomy, because imagine if from a female, that is XX chromosome, if one of the X chromosome goes missing, then what will it happen? It will result in a condition called X0. 0 refers to absence of the other pair, or basically presence of just one solo X chromosome. So the person will have 44 autosomes plus the person will have XO. So you can just write it as 44 comma XO. Okay, so the total number of chromosomes will be equal to how much? The total number of chromosomes will only be equal to a total of 45 instead of the normal diploid number of 46. Because this female lacks one of the X chromosome, the number is 45, and she will have 44 autosomes, and she will have only one solo X chromosome, and therefore the features will be, the female has rudimentary ovary, lack of secondary sexual characters, and the female will be sterile and will not be able to produce or bear children. So with this, we complete the synopsis of the chapter, Principles of Inheritance and Variation. Now let us move on to a quick synopsis of the chapter Evolution. You all know about evolutionary biology being a branch of science that mostly deals with the study of history of life forms on its earth. And we also, in this chapter, forms on earth. So life forms on earth is basically being dealt with in the case of evolutionary biology. Throughout the years, the millions and millions of years that have passed, we have only seen there's one thing that is constant: change. Change is the only constant. New organisms have come from previously existing or pre-existing organisms, and in this chapter we are not concerned with the evolution of non-living things. We are only concerned about evolution of living forms on this planet, and that's why it is referred to as organic evolution. How did the life first originate? The theory of panspermia or cosmozoa suggests that they were meteorites which were passing through the Earth's atmosphere, which carried in them the spores or the germs of first life, and when they happened to collide with the Earth, they inoculated these early germs of life onto our planet. However, today some of them do believe in this theory that life came from outer space and from some other alien planet, and this was strongly supported by Richter in the year 1865. The theory of abiogenesis or spontaneous genesis says that life originated suddenly and spontaneously from decaying and rotting matter. See, how did decaying and rotting matter like straw, mud, etc. like so? For example, people saw when ponds dried up, they saw fishes dying, fishes fighting for their lives at the bottom of the pond, and they thought the bottom of the pond, which had the mud, had transformed magically into the fishes, and they thought that raindrops magically transformed into fishes and frogs and toads, and they saw that they also thought that the hair on the horse's tail magically transformed into earthworms. So all this was misconception and myth that people believed in, that from decaying and rotting matter life can exist. But however, even great philosophers like Aristotle and Van Helmont supported this particular theory of abiogenesis, and you all are aware how Louis Pasteur, through his ingenious set of experiments using swan-necked flask and also using the killed yeast broth, he proved that life cannot originate spontaneously from decaying organic matter. Like how when he boiled the broth and kept it open in the flask, he saw that the broth was contaminated with germs, but he boiled it and sealed the neck of the flask and it remained uncontaminated. If life were to originate within the boiled broth, then it would have still originated when it was not in contact with the outer atmosphere, but the broth remained uncontaminated on sealing the mouth of the flask. That shows that spontaneously the germs or contamination or life forms could not originate from the older broth or from the decaying and the rot, and the broth represents the decaying and the rotting organic matter. So using this experiment from the pre-sterilized flasks which contained killed yeast broth, and while some of them were kept open to the air, we saw that new organisms arose only in those killed yeast broth that was open to the air, but not those broth or that broth which was placed in a flask whose neck or whose mouth was sealed. That means it was not exposed to the outside environment. The most widely accepted theory, very convincing, is the theory of biogenesis, that life originates from pre-existing life. However, there is a problem with this. It only talks about continuity of life. It does not talk about the origin of life. And this was supported by Oparin and Haldane, and they were the first ones to say that life initially happened through abiogenesis first and biogenesis later. And they said that the first form of life could have originated from non-living, very important, non-living organic matter like RNA, protein, etc. And later, when the first cell took its shape, the life always came only from that pre-existing life. So the first life came from non-living, and then on, the life came only from the first life that came into existence. So it is abiogenesis first and biogenesis ever since, which is supported by Oparin and Haldane. And you know how origin of life took place, or origin of our planet took place. You can see that the history of universe dates back to 20 billion years ago, where huge clusters of dust and gases, clouds of dust and gases called nebulae were present. These nebulae gave rise to the earliest of galaxies. And in galaxies, solar systems evolved, where there was a revolving hot ball of gases which became our sun, and surrounding them the revolving belts of gases broke off into fragments and gradually developed into planets. And you know, the most widely accepted theory to explain the origin of universe is that there was a singular massive explosion of unimaginable proportions, which constitutes the Big Bang theory, which was given by Ab Lemaitre. Now, to prove the theory of Oparin and Haldane, that was what does Oparin and Haldane say? Oparin and Haldane believed in the biochemical theory, the naturalistic theory, the physico-chemical theory, or the theory of chemical synthesis, which is basically what? Chemical evolution. They believed that life, the very first life, came from non-living substances, and then ever since, life came only from the pre-existing life. So that was the experiment, the proof for this particular theory, that is by Oparin and Haldane, was given by Urey and Miller's experiment in 1953. The conditions that they considered, they took a glass apparatus, they constructed a glass apparatus consisting of a boiling water on one end and a spark discharge chamber with tungsten electrodes, and they introduced a mixture of gases, methane and hydrogen and ammonia. Include hydrogen here. These were believed to be the earliest gases which were released on our planet when the early earth was formed, and the earth was still a molten mass, and slowly as it started solidifying, the molten material from inside, due to the constant collisions of planetesimals or the extraterrestrial bodies, they basically oozed out these gases into the atmosphere. That's why he considered these gases in his experiment. And they also set up an apparatus, like I told you. The apparatus was called the spark discharge apparatus. In this apparatus, they carefully let in this mixture of gases. There was steam at 800 degrees centigrade. They did not let in oxygen. Please remember, they maintained an airtight apparatus to basically simulate the condition that existed in the prebiotic earth, where there was absolutely no atmosphere in the air. It was considered to be a reducing type of atmosphere. And then they left this apparatus running. See, you can imagine that when you pass steam, the steam kept circulating in the apparatus, and the steam carried this mixture of gases to the spark discharge chamber, which had a pair of tungsten electrodes, which was generating high voltage electric sparks. Okay, and then the high voltage electric sparks generated in the spark discharge chamber, the gases were passed through. After that, after they passed through the spark discharge chamber, the gases were allowed to get condensed by passing them through a cooling jacket or a condenser, and they were collected in a U-trap, a liquid that was collected. They actually collected a red colored liquid in the apparatus after running the experiment for about a week's time, and on analyzing the chemical composition of that liquid, surprisingly they saw that the liquid contained a lot of organic acids and pigments and carbohydrates, as well as, most importantly, purines and pyrimidines and amino acids, which are all believed to be the building blocks, the simple organic monomers, which are the building blocks of life. Okay, so that was about the Urey-Miller's theory, as well as the Urey-Miller's experiment, that is Stanley Miller and his professor Harold Urey, way back in 1953. And now moving on to the Darwin's theory, the famous, the person who gave the origin of a species by natural selection, who is believed to be a very critical contributor in the field of evolution. He was the one who said that every organism has maximum ability to reproduce, but provided you give them favorable environmental condition. This was called prodigality or overproduction. He said that once there is survival of maximum organisms, there is constant struggle that is existing between them, and this constant struggle, not only struggle among themselves, but struggle against inanimate objects, like struggle against natural calamities like floods and droughts and volcanic eruptions, struggle against certain natural or biotic agents like diseases, like pathogens, and even accidents in the environment which are a result of natural calamities is considered to be an inanimate struggle. And then you can say that when they are constantly struggling, what makes them different in facing their struggle? Some of them face the struggle better, some of them face the struggle not that well, because they have different variations. No two organisms are similar. There are genetic variations. Of course, he didn't know the basis of variation. He said that there are certain variations that exist in organisms. Those that supposedly, luckily, or by chance they have a beneficial variation which allows them to face the struggle will emerge to be the fitter organisms. They will survive, and those which have variations which are harmful to them, which do not contribute towards them facing the struggle, will ultimately be eliminated from the population, and they become the unfit. So basically, the ones which have beneficial variations, they can adapt better, they can make resource utilization better, they can face the challenges, they can face the struggle with nature and other members, because by chance they have beneficial variation. And since they have beneficial variation, since they face the struggle better, since they win the struggle, they are considered to be the fitter ones. So this is the concept of survival of the fittest. However, according to Darwin, he only gave stress upon reproductive fitness, that only if an organism is capable of reproduction, then only it is considered to be a fitter organism. Okay. And then, since nature is operational in every step here, who is throwing the challenge at the particular organism, who is creating the struggle, who is simulating that struggle? It is all nature. And ultimately, if an organism wins the struggle, faces the struggle, because the organism by chance has a beneficial variation and emerges to be a fitter organism, then everything is because of nature. So nature has selected the fitter organism. That's why it is referred to as natural selection. Over the years, as years and years and thousands and 10,000s and millions of years pass, these beneficial variations keep accumulating up to a point where the organism accumulates so many variations over the years that it becomes so distinct from its ancestor that it becomes a better adapted and a new species. Evidences for evolution: we have fossil evidences. The most direct evidences for evolution is the fossil evidences. These fossils are basically obtained from the rocks. These are hard parts of the life forms that lived in the past. So they are the ones which are like the windows into the past, which give us an idea about what forms of organisms were living in the past. Some fossils can resemble the modern organisms that they represent. See, even dinosaur fossils have bones, and their anatomy of their bones is very similar to the reptiles that are living today, isn't it? The skull, the temporal fossa that they have in their skull, the position and the kind of dentition they have, everything resembles reptiles of today. So some fossils resemble modern day organisms, and that is what made Darwin think that probably all of us are related in this web of life, and that all of us came from those organisms which were living in the past. And that shows that there is continuity of species that has occurred over several millions of years, isn't it? Then comparative anatomy, you know about homology. Homology is something, a homologous structure is a structure which has similar anatomical structure, but it is evolved along different lines to perform different functions as adaptations to different needs. So it usually talks about a common origin, a common structure, but different function. Like for example, if you see the forelimb of whale, a forelimb of bat, cheetah and humans. Forelimb of whale is modified to act as a flipper, of that of a bat is modified to act as a wing or a patagium, of that of a cheetah is modified to run quickly, of that of a human is modified to manipulate the surrounding. We are very skilled and in manipulating the surrounding environment. So you can see, but surprisingly the bones of all the four limbs are the same. So we have anatomically similar structures which are basically evolved along different lines to perform different functions or adapted to different conditions or different functions, and this is referred to as homology. It talks about a pattern of evolution which is a kind of divergent evolution, because it starts from a common point and diverges in all directions. The common point represents the same anatomical structure, and the different points represents the modification to suit a different function or a different purpose. So it talks about homology, talks about divergent evolution. It is also a hint towards common ancestry. I already told you the forelimbs of whale acts as a paddle, the wind is modified for flight, and that of the humerus, all of them have the same set of bones in them, but they are modified for different functions. So homology is the pattern of evolution, the divergent evolution that you see, and the phenomenon in which you see structures called homologous structures, which have same anatomical structure but are evolved along different lines to perform different functions to suit or to adapt to different needs. Okay, so this is what I was telling you. It is referred to as a divergent evolution or homology, and it is indicative of a common ancestry. And like I said, it evolves along different directions, along different lines as adaptations for different needs, but they have the same basic organization or the same anatomical structure. So divergent evolution is the same thing that we were discussing now, and opposite to homology is analogy, where you have structures which perform similar function but they are anatomically very, very different. They look alike, they may not necessarily look alike. I'm sorry that it is mentioned look alike. It's not necessarily look alike, but they are performing the same function but they are not anatomically similar. So what differentiates them is their anatomy, and this is why this is referred to as the convergent evolution. Different anatomical structures modified for the same function. The convergence point is the function, and that's why it is called convergent evolution. Or analogy also talks about different ancestry. Eye of octopus is very very similar to eye of mammal in that we function the same. Both of them are meant for vision, but their structures are entirely different. Flippers of penguin and flippers of dolphin are meant to swim, but the structures are different. Sweet potato and potato are meant for storage of food. Function is the same, but sweet potato is a root modification, potato is a stem modification. So by these examples, I think it is quite clear to you what analogy means. Artificial selection by man. Now over hundreds and hundreds of years we have bred so many different animals, so many different plants. All the plants that we eat today, the rice, the cereals, the grains that we eat today were once upon a time wild varieties, but today we have domesticated them to suit our requirement, and similarly animals have been domesticated. If man can do something like this in a matter of 1000, 2000, 3000 years, why can't nature create evolution over a period of millions of years, is the argument of artificial selection by man. Industrial melanism is a very good example of how you saw that in a collection of moths made in 1850 before industrialization. So during the late 19th century there was industrialization that started. Before industrialization in England, most of the moths were light colored or white winged moths, but later there was a drastic shift in the population to having more number of dark winged moths. That is because after industrialization the trees got covered in soot, and the white winged moths were very easily visible to the predatory birds, and the black winged moths has a selective advantage because these moths would rest on the tree trunks during the daytime, and that is when they would be preyed upon by their birds. This clearly shows that the bird is the selecting agent over here, and the white winged moths have an advantage in conditions which are unpolluted, and the dark winged moths have an advantage, and the shift in population is a very good classical example for natural selection. So I just told you that before and after industrialization what happened. Before industrialization there was more white winged moths, and after industrialization there were more dark winged moths, and therefore if you have a mixed population based on the external circumstances, either of them which are capable of better adapting, which are capable of raising up to the challenges thrown by nature, they are the ones that are going to be surviving, and the others which cannot adapt themselves, like for example after pollution, that is when the trees got covered with black soot, the white winged moths were at a selective disadvantage because during the daytime they would be very contrastingly visible against the black background, and so therefore we can consider under such circumstances the white winged moths as unfit, whereas the ones which survived, the dark winged moths after pollution, after industrialization, we can consider them as fit. So how the table changes, isn't it? The table gets turned around, isn't it? So before industrialization the white winged moths were fit, but after industrialization the black winged moths are fit. Nothing is predetermined. Everything in evolution is stochastic. Everything happens as a matter of chance. Even resistance against pesticides and herbicides. Now we use a lot of DDT and we spray a lot of insecticides to kill cockroaches and mosquitoes and all that, but over the years we will see that the cockroaches and the mosquitoes become immune to them. That is because whenever you are spraying something, you are not killing the weaker ones, you are selecting the stronger ones. Some of them are bound to have beneficial variations who will be unperturbed by what you have sprayed at them, and they are going to live, they are going to reproduce, they are going to pass on their fitter genes to the next generation until all the members in the population inherit those fitter genes, and one day you will spray something, none of them will die. So you are selecting for the stronger ones, not just eliminating the weaker ones. Okay. Therefore, it is clear that evolution is, I was telling you, it is a stochastic process. It doesn't follow a definite direction, and today the white winged moths are living happily, tomorrow the dark winged moths will live happily. So there is no specific reason. You cannot say, oh, before industrialization the fate of the white winged moths were good and now the fate has become bad. So it is not something that is predetermined. It is not something that can be explained. It is something which is purely a matter of chance. It is non-directional. It is something which is not predetermined, and that's why it is called a stochastic process. Okay. Adaptive radiation, you must have seen how Darwin studied a group of these small black birds when he visited the Galapagos Island, and these birds were named as the Darwin's finches, and he saw that there were so many varieties of finches with so many varieties of beaks. He conjectured that all of them must have originated from a common ancestor on the same island. Probably all of them living on an island belonged to the same species, but gradually, because of competition, they started occupying different habitats on the same island and started adapting themselves to new food habits, and as a result their beaks modified to suit the new food habits. Okay, then moving on to the Hardy-Weinberg principle, now we are going to shift towards population genetics. According to the Hardy-Weinberg principle, the frequency of an allele or a gene or a locus will remain constant whether it is the frequency of a dominant allele or a frequency of a recessive allele, unless and until it is disturbed by certain agencies. So generally the allelic frequency is stable and remains constant from one generation to another generation. If we consider a particular population, the sum total of all their alleles and gene in the population is referred to as the gene pool, and we can deduce two relations here. One is with respect to allelic frequency, that is P plus Q is equal to 1, that is in a stable population the frequency of the dominant allele plus the frequency of the recessive allele will always be equal to 1, and we can also say that in terms of genotypic frequency, P plus Q whole square is equal to 1, that is P square plus 2PQ plus Q square is equal to 1. When I say P square, it is the frequency of the dominant homozygous genotype, plus 2PQ is the frequency of the dominant and recessive heterozygous, and Q square is the frequency of the recessive homozygous A, that is small a, which is always equal to 1. So one equation you should know, the first one is this one, the first one with respect to allelic frequency, the second one with respect to genotypic frequency. So we saw how the frequency of individuals capital A will be P square, the frequency of individuals that is small a homozygous will be Q square, and the frequency of individuals which have capital A small a will be equal to 2 into P into Q. So the equation gets reduced into P square plus 2PQ plus Q square is equal to 1, which can be expressed as P plus Q in the P plus Q whole square is equal to 1. Some of the things which disturb the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is gene migration. When migration is happening of a part of a population from one place to another, not only do they bring about changes in the population to which they have immigrated, but also they carry the genes away from the parental population, and therefore in the new as well as the old population there will be certain changes in the allelic frequency. Genetic drift is something which is entirely random, a sudden random, purely as a matter of chance. If there is a change in allelic frequency, say for example if there is a change in f of a, or if there is a change in f of small a, which is now no longer constant because of this genetic drift, and this is also called the Sewall-Wright effect, named after the scientist who worked on the genetic drift. And you can also talk about another phenomenon which is a separate concept from genetic drift. It is called founder's effect, where individuals which migrate to a new area, which set up a new population of their own, which establish a new gene frequency in that new area, and those few individuals which dared enough to leave a population and establish a new population at a new habitat are called founders. And these members, the drifted population, the original drifted population, are considered founders, and this effect is called the founder's effect. Mutations are sudden, large, inheritable changes. Of course, if mutation happens, the frequency of the allele can change, and recombination also during sexual reproduction brings about reshuffling of genes that can cause changes in gene frequency. So ultimately what happens here is we can also say that until and unless there is any disturbance, everything remains constant. That is the idea behind Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. But seldom is this possible in natural population, because in natural population lot of changes are happening. So Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is more or less a theoretical concept, because in practicality most of the populations are constantly under changes, and therefore allelic frequencies are bound to change. And it is important to know the different different types of natural selection. If one of the phenotype is favored, then it is called directional change. If both are favored, like for example, if there are plants which are tall and dwarf in a population, if only plants are tall, that is only one phenotype is being favored by nature, then it is called directional selection. If there is a mixture of tall and dwarf plants equally, then nature is selecting both tall, which is one extreme of a phenotype, and dwarf, that is the other extreme of a phenotype. So when both extremes of a phenotype are selected by nature, it is called disruptive or diversifying selection. And another one is called stabilization selection. In stabilization, or I think it's given in the next slide, or it's not mentioned here, it is called a stabilizing selection. In stabilizing selection, nature will select heterozygous individuals, isn't it? So heterozygous individuals are those which probably express something which is of an intermediate character. It cannot be in the example tall and dwarf I gave you. It selects mostly the heterozygotes are selected rather than homozygous capital T and homozygous small t. So when nature selects intermediate phenotype or heterozygotes, it is called stabilizing selection. When nature selects either of the homozygotes, either tall or dwarf, it is called directional selection. That is two extremes of a phenotype. When nature selects both the extremes such that you have a mixed population, then it is called diversifying or disruptive selection. A brief account of evolution. As early as 2000 million years ago, the first cellular forms arose, and then some of these cells, because of the ability to develop a mechanism called photosynthesis, they had the ability to fix the solar energy, to split the water, to develop oxygen, and that's when everything became it was a revolution in the life of life on earth, and this was called oxygen revolution, and that is thanks to them being able to release oxygen. Slowly, single-celled organisms became multicellular organisms. By the time of 500 billion years ago, invertebrates were formed. Jawless fishes, we have only one representative today called Cyclostomata, probably evolved as early as 350 million years ago. Seaweeds, the earliest algae and few plants existed 320 million years ago. The first organisms that were to reach land were plants, the land vascular plants, and then later animals moved on to land. Then fishes came which had stout and strong fins. For example, you have this was about 350 million years ago. One such fish was actually thought to have become extinct, but in 1938 it was rediscovered off the coast of South Africa. It happened to be a lobe fin called a coelacanth. It is called a lobe fin because at the base of its fin it has a lot of flesh. So fleshy fins, like as if the fins were meant to function like arms, like limbs. So that means they could walk on the sea floor, and that means probably they came from the ancestors who could literally creep onto the ground whenever they wanted, breathe on the ground as well, and then go back to the sea as and when they wished. And therefore these are probably the early ancestors of what we see today, that is of both modern day frogs and salamanders. And then we have the amphibians that became reptiles, and reptiles such as turtles, crocodiles and tortoises. And then reptiles became so dominant and so varied in their shapes and sizes that they became the dominant organisms on this planet. And then came giant ferns which were buried into the earth's crust, and today which have formed the coal deposits which we are reaping the benefits of it today. And then there came fish-like reptiles called ichthyosaurs by 200 million years ago. And then the most important dinosaurs came into existence, the golden era of dinosaurs during the Jurassic period. One of them was the tallest of all and the most dreaded predator, which was called the Tyrannosaurus rex. And by 65 million years ago, during the Cretaceous period, sadly the dinosaurs became extinct. Nobody really knows why they became extinct. Some say it was climatic changes, some say there was a meteorite collision, but some say most of them, the fitter ones evolved into the birds, the unfit ones got eliminated from the planet. Correct? The first mammals were very, very tiny mammals. They were called shrews. They were very small sized, and mammals, as you all know, are viviparous. They're very good in protecting their unborn young, because the unborn young is not inside the egg outside the mother's body, but it is sitting inside the mother's body in the womb, well protected. So mammals were also very clever and intelligent in sensing and avoiding danger, at least. That's why probably we are so successful on this planet today. When reptiles came down, mammals took over the earth, and there were lots lot of mammals in South America like horse, hippopotamus, bear, rabbit, etc. And then due to continental drift, what collided with what? North America collided with South America, and very soon mammals present in South America faced severe competition from mammals coming down from North America. But in animals, how come the pouched mammals or the marsupials survive? Because Australia probably got separated at a very early stage during continental drift, and you know that Australia is surrounded by sea on all sides. So how would these animals even migrate over there, and how would these other animals create a competition for the pouched mammals? So pouched mammals were living very happily in Australia without any competition, and that's why probably today we find them only in case of Australia. And there are some mammals which are completely adapted to a secondary aquatic mode of life, because they need to come to the surface of water in order to breathe, like in the case of whales and dolphins and seals and sea cows are some of the few examples. Now in this chapter we are only going to focus upon the origin and evolution of man, which is a very interesting story of evolution. 15 million years ago came the Dryopithecus and Ramapithecus. Dryopithecus was more ape-like, whereas Ramapithecus was more man-like. Probably Ramapithecus is considered to be the ancestor of man. Then later they discovered few fossils in East Africa, that is in Ethiopia and Tanzania, and it revealed certain human-like features, and then it led to the belief that about 4 to 3 million years ago, man-like primates walked on the Eastern Africa. They were probably not more than 4 feet tall, but they walked upright. 2 million years ago, very fairly after compared to 4 to 3, 2 million years ago, which is more recent, they identified that Australopithecus probably lived in the East African grasslands. He hunted with stone weapons but essentially ate fruit. Some of the bones among the bones discovered were different, and then they gave rise to a clue that the first human-like being, the hominid, was called Homo habilis, and he had a brain capacity, the cranial capacity of 650 to 800 cc. He probably did not eat meat. Fossils discovered in Java in 1891 revealed the next stage, that is called the erect man, the Homo erectus. Remember, the Homo habilis is the one that probably started living a community life. That's why he's called habilis. He's also the able man or the skillful man. And Homo erectus came into existence from Homo habilis probably 1.5 million years ago. He probably ate meat, and his cranial capacity is much larger than Homo habilis. It is about 900 cc. And then came the Neanderthal man with a very large brain size, or a brain cranial capacity, or the volume of his cranium in the skull, that is 1400 cc. He lived near East and Central Asia between 1 lakh to 40,000 years ago. For the first time, he showed some kind of a cultural evolution as well, where he used to protect his body, covering his body with animal hide or skin, and they also exhibited certain rituals such as burying their dead. And then came Homo sapiens, which probably arose in Africa, and sometime during the Ice Age between 75 to 10,000 years ago, the modern Homo sapiens arose, isn't it? And then prehistoric cave art developed around 18,000 years ago. Agriculture came about 10,000 years back, and human settlement started. The rest of what we happened is a part of human history of growth and decline of civilizations. So you have to remember the major fossil forms like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthal man, Homo sapiens, the earliest ones Dryopithecus and Ramapithecus. It is very important for you to also remember the cranial capacities. Okay, so with this we complete the synopsis of 2 chapters, that is Principles of Inheritance and the Evolution chapter. So thank you.